The crowd's laughter was louder than the music. Under the harsh lights of the tiny club, Lucien stood alone on stage. He gripped the microphone as jeers and mocking applause crashed over him like cold rain. His voice, once filled with hope, trembled against the weight of so many dismissive eyes. Years later, that same voice would rise again. Stronger, deeper, impossible to ignore. But in that moment, all he knew was humiliation. He would leave the stage that night shamed and nearly broken, carrying wounds no critic could see, yet beneath the pain lay something unyielding, a quiet promise he whispered only to himself. I am not done. Keep watching, because this is not just a story about talent. It's about the cost of believing in your own worth when no one else will. Lucien never forgot the feeling of that night. The glare of the overhead lights, the sticky floor beneath his worn-out boots, and the way the audience had turned on him so fast. One minute they were politely nodding along. The next the room pulsed with ridicule. It started with a single drawn-out whistle, the kind meant to wound more than tease. Then it swelled into a chorus of catcalls that sliced through every note he tried to hold. He was only 23, and though he'd been singing since childhood, this was the first time he dared to step onto a professional stage in his own name. The club's owner had given him the last slot of the night. Some small mercy, Lucien supposed. So fewer people would witness his embarrassment. But half the local industry scene seemed to have gathered anyway, eager to sip cheap drinks and exchange gossip about who might be worth their attention. As he finished his final song, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the microphone. He didn't wait for the applause. He knew none would come. Instead, he walked off stage in silence, the bitter taste of shame rising in his throat. Behind the curtains, he nearly collided with Trevor, a guitarist he'd once called a friend. Trevor was lounging against a stack of crates, his arms folded across his chest, an amused smirk on his lips. You really thought you could pull this off? Trevor asked, his voice dripping with condescension. You're not exactly marketable, Lucien swallowed, willing himself not to respond. Another voice chimed in. Sandra, a rising pop singer who'd once shared rehearsal space with him. You should probably stick to writing songs for other people, she said. You just don't have the presence for this. The words stung more than he'd expected, not because he believed them, but because some part of him already feared they might be true. He left the club without saying goodbye. Outside, the night air was damp and sour with city exhaust. He pulled his threadbare coat tighter and started walking the long blocks back to his apartment. His guitar case banged against his thigh in time with his steps, the only rhythm he could still trust. Back home, he sat on the edge of his mattress. No bed frame, just the mattress, and stared at the calluses on his fingers. He'd earned them through countless hours of practice. Every time he'd been told he wasn't enough, he'd played until his hands throbbed. He remembered the first time he'd sung for a real audience, back in his small town's church hall. He'd been 12, voice still changing, so nervous he'd nearly thrown up backstage. But when he began to sing, the hush that fell over the room felt like a blessing, like belonging. That night felt centuries away now. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. She never missed a chance to remind him of simpler ambitions. You don't have to keep doing this to yourself. Come home. There's steady work here. A life. Lucien turned the phone face down on the floor. He knew she meant well, but she didn't understand. Music wasn't something he could walk away from. It was the only thing that had ever made him feel honest and alive. The next few months blurred together in a haze of small performances, each more discouraging than the last. Some nights he played in half-empty bars. Other nights he set up on street corners, singing to people who barely paused. He took shifts stocking shelves at a discount store to cover rent. But whenever he came home, he pulled out his battered notebook and kept writing. Songs about loneliness, about being overlooked, about how even a tiny ember of faith could keep a person warm in the dark. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, he imagined what it would feel like to step onto a real stage again, not just as a novelty act or a filler, but as someone who belonged there, someone undeniable. One evening he met Anna, a folk singer with the same dogged determination he carried like a hidden scar. They ended up at the same open mic, and afterward she offered him a ride home. You have something rare, she said as he climbed into her car. He stared out the passenger window. doesn't seem to matter much. It matters to the people who are really listening, she said softly. The rest, they'll come around, or they won't. But you can't let them decide who you are. Lucien didn't reply, but her words landed somewhere deeper than pity. When she dropped him off, he turned back to thank her. But she was already pulling away, leaving him standing under the flickering porch light, feeling less alone than he had in months. He didn't know it then, but this quiet solidarity would plant a seed he'd carry through every disappointment to come. The winter that followed was the coldest Lucien could remember. Some days the icy wind cut through even his thickest sweater as he made the long walk from the grocery store to his rented rehearsal room. The space was a converted storage unit, bare concrete walls, a single space heater that never worked, an old piano with 2 broken keys. But to Lucien, it felt like the only place in the city where he could breathe. He spent hours there each night after work, his breath fogging in the air as he practiced scales and wrote new songs. His fingertips cracked and bled from the guitar strings. His voice grew hoarse from repetition. But he kept going, convinced that if he stopped, something essential inside him would flicker out. One evening, while he was packing up, a knock echoed on the metal door. He pulled it open to find Anna standing there. She was bundled in a wool coat and holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I figured you'd be here," she said with a wry smile. He stepped aside so she could come in. She handed him a cup. Her fingers brushed his just briefly, a tiny gesture of warmth in the frozen room. They sat together in the half-light, sipping coffee and talking about nothing in particular. For a moment, the heaviness lifted. "I've been thinking," Anna said finally, "about putting together a little showcase. Just a handful of us songwriters who don't have big labels or agents. Maybe if we can pool our audiences, we'll get some attention." Lucien hesitated. He had no illusions about how the industry worked. Even if they did manage to draw a crowd, there was no guarantee it would matter. Still, something in Anna's quiet conviction reminded him of the boy he used to be. The boy who had believed in music before he believed in anything else. "All right," he said. "I'm in." The following weeks were a blur of planning. They rented a modest performance space in the back of an old theater. Anna handled the logistics, booking the other acts and creating a simple poster. Lucien offered to help cover the cost, using what little savings he had left. On the night of the showcase, the turnout was better than either of them had dared hope. Dozens of people squeezed into the space, their voices a warm hum of anticipation. When Lucien's turn came, he stepped up to the microphone and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the old fear. He just felt ready. He started with a song he'd written during the darkest stretch of winter. A slow, aching ballad about holding on when everyone else has let go. As he sang, he let the vulnerability show. He let himself be seen, flaws and all. When he finished, the room fell into a hush so complete he could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Then a single clap, then another, and suddenly the small space was filled with applause. Sincere, grateful, almost reverent. It wasn't a sold-out stadium. It wasn't the kind of triumph that changed a career overnight. But it was something, a flicker of possibility. Over the next year, Lucien played every small venue he could find. Cafes, bookstores, charity fundraisers. He recorded his first EP on borrowed equipment, mixing the tracks himself late into the night. Anna helped him set up an online store to sell the CDs, and slowly, so slowly he almost didn't notice it began to add up. People started sharing his songs on social media. A local radio host reached out to schedule an interview. Little by little, Lucien's name was no longer met with dismissive laughter. But even as momentum gathered, he struggled with doubt. One afternoon, he sat with Anna in her kitchen, staring into his mug of tea. "Sometimes I think they were right," he admitted. "Maybe I'm just not meant for this." Anna looked at him evenly. "Then why are you still here?" He didn't have an answer. She reached across the table, her palm resting over his. "You're still here because you care more about the music than about proving them wrong. That's why it matters." Her words sank in like warmth through his chilled bones. By the time Lucien turned 30, he had built a modest following. Nothing flashy, but loyal. He played a sold-out show in a mid-sized theater, and afterward people waited in line to have him sign their programs. He still remembered every insult, every snide remark from those early days. but they no longer defined him. Late that night, he packed up his guitar and stepped into the quiet street. For the first time, he felt something like peace. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. It began with a voicemail. Lucien had come home from another small gig, exhausted and elated in equal measure. He dropped his guitar case by the door, kicked off his boots, and pressed play on his answering machine. A voice he didn't recognize filled the room. Smooth, professional, a little weary. "Mr. Hayes, my name is Leonard Kane. I'm a producer with Emerald Horizon Records. I heard your set last week at the Tanglewood and picked up one of your CDs. There's something in your work I haven't heard in a long time. If you're interested in talking about a project, give me a call." Lucien froze, one hand still resting on the machine. Emerald Horizon wasn't one of the big three labels, but it was respected, known for championing artists who valued substance over flash. He replayed the message twice more before daring to believe it was real. The next morning, he met Anna for breakfast. He left his number, Lucien said, sliding his phone across the table. "I don't even know if I should call back." Anna looked up from her coffee, her eyes sharp with something between caution and hope. "You should call," she said. "But be ready. If you do this, everything changes." He knew what she meant. Signing with a label would mean more exposure, more scrutiny, more opportunities for people to tear him down again. But it would also mean he'd finally have the chance to share his music, without fighting for every scrap of validation. That afternoon, his hands still trembling, he dialed the number. Leonard Kane answered on the second ring. They met a week later, in a sleek, understated office lined with framed platinum records. Kane was older than Lucien expected, with thinning hair and kind eyes. "I won't waste your time," Kane said. "I've been in this business 30 years, and most of what I hear these days is polished but empty. Your songs, they're raw, honest. I think people are starved for that." Lucien tried to read his expression, searching for any hint of condescension or insincerity, but found none. "You'd have creative control," Kane went on. "We'd start with a single. If it does well, we'll talk about a full album." Lucien could hardly process it. For so long, he'd pictured doors slamming shut in his face. Now one had swung open so wide it startled him. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Kane smiled. "Because your voice sounds like someone who's been to hell and decided to keep singing anyway." The next months were a blur. Recording sessions, photo shoots, press interviews. Lucien moved through it all with cautious wonder, never letting himself get too comfortable. The other artists signed to Emerald Horizon were mostly polite, though a few seemed wary. He was after all the scrappy unknown who'd somehow landed a coveted spot. Still, there were moments when the old insecurities surfaced. He'd be halfway through a take when a voice in his head would whisper, "You don't belong here. Any minute they'll figure it out." But then he'd think of Anna, of the nights he'd spent in that freezing rehearsal space, of every person who'd ever told him to quit. And he'd keep singing. His first single, Shadows in the Glass, debuted modestly on streaming platforms. A few hundred plays at first, then thousands, then tens of thousands. One morning, Lucien woke to find it had cracked the top 50 on a major chart. He stood in his kitchen, the kettle whistling behind him, staring at his phone in disbelief. That week, industry blogs picked up the story. Unknown singer breaks through with haunting ballad. Radio stations began calling. Concert promoters, too. And then came the invitation that would change everything. Emerald Horizon was organizing a televised charity concert, an annual event watched by millions. Kane wanted Lucien to perform. "It's a big risk," Kane warned. "If it goes well, it could launch you to a new level. If it doesn't..." He didn't finish the thought. Lucien didn't need him to. He spent days deciding. He thought about the laughter in that first club, the dismissive looks, the fear that he'd never escape those memories. But in the end, he knew he couldn't say no. "I'll do it," he told Kane. The producer nodded solemnly. "Then we'd better make it count." On the night of the concert, Lucien stood in the wings, listening to the roar of the crowd. A decade ago, he wouldn't have dared imagine himself here. He smoothed his shirt, adjusted the in-ear monitor, and drew a steadying breath. As the host introduced him, he stepped onto the stage, bright lights warming his face, the vast audience a sea of shadows. He closed his eyes. This time he wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He was here because he'd never stopped believing in the music. and he was finally ready to let the world hear it. The first notes of shadows in the glass spilled into the cavernous hall. Haunting and spare, Lucien's voice floated above the piano, husky with emotion, each lyric carrying the weight of all he had endured. Somewhere in the front rows he saw faces turning toward each other in recognition. The song had been streamed, shared, whispered about. But hearing it live was different. It was immediate, unavoidable. As he reached the chorus, Lucien felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The old fear that his voice might crack, that they might laugh, that he would never be enough. But the laughter never came. Instead, a hush fell over the audience so profound it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. When the final chord faded, there was a heartbeat of silence. Then an eruption of applause that seemed to shake the floor. He bowed his head, unable to stop the tears that blurred his vision. This was what he had waited for. Not fame, not validation, just the chance to share something honest, and be met with understanding instead of ridicule. Backstage, he was immediately pulled into a whirl of congratulations. Kane hugged him, his voice rough. "You did it, Lucien. You really did it." Anna was there too. She pressed her hand to his cheek and laughed softly. "I told you they'd hear you someday." His phone buzzed in his pocket. A flood of messages and missed calls. Labels, agents, journalists, even some of the very artists who had once mocked him. He scanned the names and felt a complicated ache. Part of him wanted to ignore them all, to pretend he didn't care. But another part, the part that still remembered being 19 and humiliated, felt something like release. They had been wrong about him, and he had been right to keep going. In the days that followed, the performance went viral. Clips circulated across every platform, videos of Lucien alone on that vast stage, voice breaking on the final verse. Suddenly everyone wanted a piece of him. Invitations to festivals, late-night interviews, a meeting with the producers of a prestigious documentary series. He took none of it for granted. Each morning he still rose early, made himself tea, spent hours refining new songs. The world might have changed overnight, but the work itself was the same. One afternoon, a journalist came to interview him for a long-form profile. "You've become something of a symbol," she remarked, flipping through her notes. "People see your story as proof that resilience wins in the end." Lucien considered that. "I'm grateful," he said finally. "But I don't think I'm any braver than anyone else who's ever been told they're worthless." "I just didn't know how to stop." The journalist looked up, eyes softening. "Do you ever think about those first clubs, the people who laughed? All the time," he admitted, but not with anger anymore. She nodded, as though she understood. He did think about them, especially at night, when the world quieted and memories drifted back. He remembered the first time he had stepped on a stage, the jeers, the loneliness. He also remembered Anna, standing beside him when no one else would. And he remembered the younger version of himself, so desperate to be seen, so certain he never would be. Sometimes he wished he could go back and tell that boy that he was stronger than he knew, that every humiliation would someday become a rung on the ladder he was climbing. But he couldn't. All he could do was keep climbing. Months later, when Lucien headlined his first sold-out arena tour, he invited Anna to join him on stage for the encore. Under the hot lights, he took her hand. The crowd cheered as she tried and failed to hold back tears. "This is as much hers as it is mine," he said into the microphone. He glanced out across the thousands of faces. Strangers and old fans, and somewhere, no doubt, a few of the people who had once told him he'd never matter. In that moment, Lucien felt an overwhelming sense of completion. Not vindication, something gentler. A quiet triumph that didn't need to prove itself to anyone. After the final song, he lingered on stage, taking it all in. The cheers, the lights, the knowledge that he had earned every bit of it. He thought again of that boy in the freezing rehearsal room, singing to an audience of no one. He wished he could say to him, "You were never alone. You just couldn't see it yet." Lucien stepped forward and gave the crowd one last bow. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew finally that he was ready for it. The months that followed the arena tour became a blur of milestones Lucien had only ever dreamed about. His album climbed the charts, settling into the top spot for weeks. Music magazines declared it a modern classic, praising its rawness and lyrical depth. What struck him most was the letters. Handwritten notes from fans poured in, some from teenagers who saw themselves in his loneliness, some from people older than his parents, telling him that his songs had brought them comfort after losses of their own. He read each letter carefully, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times, struck by the reminder that music was never really about acclaim. It was about connection. The same connection he'd always longed for, back when he was just another invisible boy with a guitar no one believed in. Late one evening, as Lucien sat alone in his studio, he looked around the room and tried to take it in. The gold records lining the walls, the photographs of sold-out crowds, the shelves of awards. None of it had come quickly. Every success had been built on nights when he nearly gave up, on years when no one cared whether he existed, and he felt no bitterness about that anymore. He had learned that there was no shortcut through humiliation, no bypass around failure. The path had been exactly as hard as it needed to be, to shape him into someone who could stand in the spotlight without losing himself. He thought back to the day he'd first met Leonard Kane in that sleek office. He'd been terrified then, sure that Kane would discover he was a fraud. Now they were partners in every sense. Kane had become a mentor and a friend, someone who had seen the value in Lucien's songs when almost no one else did. At the final show of the tour, Kane stood in the wings with Anna, both of them watching Lucien finish his set. As he came off stage, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt, Kane reached out and gripped his shoulder. "You're not the same man you were when we started," Kane said. Lucien looked back at the stage, the crowd still roaring for more. "No," he agreed softly, "but I think I finally became the man I was meant to be." That night, Anna and Lucien sat together on a quiet hotel balcony, overlooking the city skyline. She studied his face, as though memorizing it. "Do you ever wish it hadn't been so hard?" she asked. He thought about it for a long time. "No," he said finally, "because every setback taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way." He reached over and took her hand. "I don't wish it had been easier. I just wish I'd known all along that it would be worth it." Anna smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think you always did," she whispered. When Lucien finally returned to the small town where it all began, he wasn't sure what to expect. Some of the old faces still worked at the clubs where he'd first performed. Some of the same people who had laughed at him once now asked for autographs, or shyly thanked him for inspiring them. He felt no need to gloat, no impulse to say, "See, you were wrong." He only felt gratitude that he'd survived that time with his spirit intact. One evening he visited the little rehearsal space he'd rented so many years before. Dusty folding chairs still sat in the corner. The battered microphone he'd saved for lay abandoned on a shelf. He stood there alone for a long time, letting the memories wash over him. Then he set his hand on the old mic and whispered, "Thank you." The final concert of the year was held in a grand theater where he'd once dreamed of performing. Tickets sold out in minutes. As he walked out onto that stage, his heart calm in a way it had never been before. He thought of every person who'd doubted him, and every person who hadn't. The hush of the audience felt like a kind of reverence. He closed his eyes and began to sing. His voice filled the theater, strong and clear, carrying all the years of hope, and heartbreak, and hard-won self-respect. When the final note faded, there was a beat of silence, then an ovation that rose like a wave and broke over him. He opened his eyes and saw faces shining with tears, strangers and friends alike, and he knew in that instant that this was what it meant to come home to yourself. He bowed low, letting the applause wash over him one last time. Then he straightened and smiled, steady, unashamed, finally at peace. Have you ever felt the world was stacked against you, only to discover your resilience was greater than you imagined? If Lucien's story spoke to you, know that your journey matters too, even when no one else can see it yet. I'd love to hear about your experiences with persistence and self-belief. Share them in the comments below. If this story inspired you, consider liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications. That way you can join us for more heartfelt narratives. Thanks for staying with me until the end. See you in the next one.